A Russian armored push was stopped in just a few minutes, and several vehicles were left disabled at the edge of the Serebryansky Forest. This sudden collapse shocked many observers because the column was advancing toward a sector long viewed as a soft point in Ukraine's defensive line. The real surprise came from the pace of Ukraine's response. Recon teams detected the movement early and passed the coordinates to artillery units. This early breakdown changed the entire rhythm of the battle and forced Russian troops to abandon their vehicles and run for cover inside the trees. The danger was clear for Ukraine because a breakthrough in this forest could have opened a direct route toward key positions near Kupiansk and deeper into Donetsk. Any gap in this sector would have shaped the momentum of future operations and increased pressure on nearby towns that have faced repeated assaults. The forest then turned into a maze where visibility dropped and every sound hinted at a threat. Ukraine used this terrain to flip the situation, and the armored push that was meant to break through became the first stage of a fight that Moscow did not expect. The key question now is how such a strong formation fell apart so fast, and whether this clash reveals a new type of warfare where smaller units with tight coordination can overpower larger armored groups. The Ukrainian reconnaissance teams detected the Russian armored column while it was still several hundred meters from the defensive zone, and this early identification shaped the entire tempo of the first contact. The observation posts reported engine movement and dust patterns that indicated a steady approach, and a reconnaissance drone confirmed that the vehicles were advancing in a compact formation inside a narrow access route. The drone operators relayed this information directly to the Fire Direction Center, and the coordinates moved through the command network without delay. This rapid flow allowed the M777 crews to prepare their firing sequence before the Russian units crossed into the forest line. The reconnaissance drone continued to track the column as it moved forward, and the cameras showed that the Russian drivers were maintaining a tight spacing that exposed the group to concentrated artillery fire. The Ukrainian teams understood that the forest edge gave them a short window in which the vehicles were visible, and they moved quickly to maintain accurate updates. The Russian units did not widen their formation and continued to rely on the idea that the dense tree cover would hide their advance from Ukrainian eyes. This gave the reconnaissance drone a clear advantage because the path the vehicles were using remained predictable and narrow. The M777 crews locked their firing data as soon as the coordinates stabilized, and the gunners aligned the barrels to strike the center of the moving formation. The Fire Direction Center issued the order once the drone confirmed that the Russian column had not changed direction or spacing. The first shots left the barrels with a timing calculated to intercept the vehicles before they could enter deeper cover. The reconnaissance team observed the initial impacts and recorded soil bursts that rose near the lead elements of the column, and this confirmation allowed the gunners to adjust their next volley quickly. The Russian vehicles reacted by attempting to accelerate toward the forest interior, and several drivers made sudden turns in an effort to escape the strike zone. The drone recorded irregular paths as the platforms tried to break away from the main track, and this created congestion that slowed the entire column. Some vehicles reached uneven ground and were forced to reduce speed, and this produced a bottleneck that left the rest of the formation exposed to follow-up strikes. The Ukrainian teams watched these movements closely because the reduced mobility increased the effectiveness of the next rounds. The M777 crews fired again with corrected coordinates, and the impacts disrupted the center of the Russian formation. The observers saw multiple vehicles lose forward motion as the pressure of the strikes built around them, and this caused the crews to abandon their platforms. The reconnaissance drone followed the soldiers as they moved toward the tree line on foot, and the feed showed small groups scattering into the undergrowth. This shift from armored movement to dismounted retreat indicated that the Russian push had lost momentum before reaching the Ukrainian defensive line. The Ukrainian reconnaissance teams continued to monitor the area around the stalled vehicles, and the information guided the follow-up decisions that shaped the next stage of the fight. The drone operators kept tracking the Russian soldiers as they tried to form new positions inside the forest, and the observers on the ground prepared to coordinate the next moves with advancing Ukrainian units. The collapse of the Russian armored approach created an opportunity for Ukraine to direct the battle deeper into the trees, and the reconnaissance elements remained focused on identifying each movement that would influence the coming engagements. The Ukrainian artillery units began their fire mission with correction rounds, and the first impacts helped the gunners adjust the distance of the next strike. The reconnaissance drone watched each burst of soil rise near the Russian vehicles, and the feed confirmed that the rounds were landing close enough to pressure the column. The M777 crews received the updated coordinates and prepared a heavier volley, and the shift from adjustment to concentrated fire became clear as multiple shells moved toward the center of the formation. The Russian drivers tried to maintain speed, yet the sudden explosions near the lead vehicles disrupted their sense of direction and created hesitation across the line. The second wave of M777 strikes reached the Russian column with enough force to damage several vehicles, and the drone showed moments when the armored platforms lost mobility after impacts landed near their tracks. The combined pressure from artillery strikes and incoming drones pushed the Russian convoy into confusion, and the rattled drivers struggled to stay calm as they searched for any space to escape the tightening fire. Several Ukrainian drones spotted these moments of hesitation and dived toward the disoriented tanks and vehicles, and the sudden explosions they triggered deepened the chaos and broke what remained of the formation's control. The Fire Direction Center kept the artillery cycle active because each new strike weakened the structural integrity of the armored push. The Russian soldiers began to exit their vehicles once the shells continued to fall across the roadbed, and this shift from mechanized movement to dismounted retreat marked a clear change in the character of the engagement. The reconnaissance drone captured groups of soldiers running toward the trees in an attempt to escape the kill zone, and the Ukrainian teams watched their movement to understand how the advance was collapsing. The artillery fire shaped this retreat by forcing the Russians to abandon any attempt to reorganize, and the distance between each soldier grew as they moved deeper into the forest without a clear direction. The Ukrainian units recognized that the loss of the armored platforms removed the main strength of the Russian attack. The repeated strikes across the column also disrupted the communication chain that the Russian crews needed for coordinated action, and the separation between the vehicles made it harder for the officers to direct any counter-movement. The drone feed showed fragments of metal and overturned supplies near the stalled vehicles, and the Ukrainian observers reported that the confusion inside the formation prevented the Russians from using their remaining mobility. The artillery pressure increased the psychological stress of the crews, and the sudden explosions that landed close to their positions drove more soldiers out of their platforms. The result was a scattered collection of troops who could not rely on armored support to continue the push. The Ukrainian M777 batteries continued their cycle until the reconnaissance teams confirmed that the vehicles were no longer able to participate in the attack. And this confirmation allowed the gunners to reduce fire while maintaining observation. The infantry movements inside the forest suggested that the Russian soldiers were preparing to hide rather than regroup, and this indicated that the mechanized push had lost its structure completely. The Ukrainian units remained alert because troops moving on foot can still create danger if allowed to reach new positions, and this awareness shaped the follow-up actions planned by the commanders. The collapse of the Russian armored movement led directly to the next phase of the battle, where the engagement shifted from open ground to the dense interior of the forest. The fight moved into the forest once the Russian soldiers left their vehicles, and this shift changed the character of the battle because both sides now had to move through tight spaces with extremely limited sightlines. The Ukrainian infantry advanced along narrow paths under the cover of trees, and each step required careful attention because the ground was uneven and the brush hid movement on both sides. The Russian troops who entered the forest ahead of them aimed their guns at suspected positions and fired short bursts to suppress any approach, and this created a constant echo that made it difficult to judge distance. The Ukrainian teams recognized that the low visibility prevented any fast push, and they slowed their pace to avoid walking into an ambush. The forest canopy blocked the view from above, and the reconnaissance drone had to move higher than usual to avoid the branches, and this reduced the clarity of the feed. The Ukrainian infantry used this moment to pull back slightly and regroup because they wanted to create space for a mortar strike that could reach the Russian troops who had taken temporary cover. The mortar crews received coordinates from spotters near the edge of the forest, and they prepared rounds that could arc over the trees and land directly where the Russian soldiers were holding. The mortar fire began after the calculations were confirmed, and the first explosions landed inside the tree line with enough force to break the rhythm of the Russian defensive posture. The Ukrainian infantry paused to listen for movement, and the sound of branches falling mixed with the echo of blasts made it clear that the pressure was forcing the Russian soldiers to reposition. Some Russian units withdrew deeper into the forest because the openings between the trees offered no protection against the incoming rounds. And this movement created gaps that the Ukrainian infantry could exploit. The Ukrainian infantry advanced again once the mortar fire lifted, and they used slow and controlled movement to avoid exposing themselves to hidden gunfire. The dense forest created blind corners at every step, and each squad had to scan the ground, the tree roots, and the dark openings under collapsed branches for signs of movement. The Russian soldiers who remained near the front line fired short bursts from behind tree trunks and broken logs, and these sudden attacks forced the Ukrainian troops to drop behind natural cover and return fire based on sound alone. The Ukrainian units realized that these positions would not hold long because the Russians who stayed were isolated from the groups that had moved deeper into the forest. The abandoned houses and dugouts became the next focus of the Ukrainian advance, and the infantry moved in pairs to approach the entrances while others provided covering fire. Some of the shelters showed signs of recent use with scattered supplies on the ground, and this reinforced the idea that Russian troops were rotating through multiple hiding spots rather than holding a single defensive line. The Ukrainian teams pushed deeper into the forest as the scattered Russian fire began to weaken, and this signaled that the earlier mortar strike had disrupted the cohesion of the Russian units. The infantry continued to move with deliberate pace, while the reconnaissance drones circled above the canopy to identify heat signatures or sudden displacement in the brush. The Ukrainian infantry moved deeper into the forest after the mortar fire broke the Russian defensive rhythm, and the next phase of the battle required them to clear every position that could hide remaining soldiers. The forest contained abandoned structures and small shelters built into the ground, and these locations became natural hiding places for Russian troops who had retreated from the initial artillery strike. The Ukrainian commanders divided their units into several small teams, and each team advanced along separate paths to search the area more effectively. The soldiers called out commands to check if anyone inside was willing to surrender, and the response came from 2 Russian troops who stepped toward the entrance with raised hands. The team tried to move closer to secure the surrender, and the situation changed as soon as the distance closed. One of the Russian soldiers threw a grenade toward the Ukrainian team, and the blast hit the ground with enough force to throw dirt across the path. The sudden attack forced the Ukrainians to drop behind trees and return fire toward the shelter, and this moment turned a controlled clearing operation into a close-range fight. The Ukrainian soldiers regrouped quickly and used their guns to keep pressure on the entrance while another member prepared a grenade for a counteraction. The team threw the grenade into the shelter, and the explosion silenced all movement inside. The Ukrainian infantry waited for dust and smoke to settle, and they then approached the destroyed entrance with careful steps. They checked the interior for surviving Russian soldiers, and the inspection confirmed that no one remained alive in the small room. The Ukrainian commanders informed the other teams about the incident, and the units increased their caution as they continued to sweep through the area. The teams advanced to other shelters that had been marked earlier by reconnaissance, and these structures varied in size and complexity. Some were simple dugouts made of dirt and logs, and others were old buildings that had been left behind long before the battle began. The Ukrainian infantry approached each target with similar procedures by issuing commands, checking for movement, and preparing to respond if resistance appeared. In several cases, the soldiers used grenades to break through narrow openings because the interiors were too dark to inspect safely from outside. Another team discovered a dugout with weakened wooden support beams, and the blast from their grenade caused part of the roof to collapse, which indicated that the Russian troops inside had no opportunity to return fire. As the clearing operation continued, the level of resistance from the Russian troops began to drop, and the Ukrainian teams found fewer signs of organized defense. The infantry units stayed alert because the forest still held many blind spots that could hide isolated soldiers who had not yet engaged. The teams worked in steady coordination and communicated every new finding to ensure that no surviving Russian group could regroup behind them. The forest floor eventually grew quiet, and the pattern of checked shelters suggested that the Ukrainian forces were close to gaining full control of the area. The final phase of the fight began when the Russian troops who had survived the earlier clashes tried to slow the Ukrainian advance by launching a UAV toward the clearing teams, and this action showed that the Russians were attempting to regain some degree of initiative. The UAV entered the area at low altitude, with a rising engine sound that alerted the Ukrainian soldiers who were moving between tree clusters. The soldiers called warnings across the line as the approaching noise grew louder, and the teams prepared to take cover behind trees in case the UAV found a target. The UAV moved through a narrow opening between the branches and began to descend toward a group of Ukrainian soldiers who were inspecting a recently cleared shelter. One Ukrainian soldier raised his gun and fired short bursts as soon as the UAV appeared, and the rounds hit the drone before it could complete its attack path. The UAV fell to the forest floor and broke apart in several pieces, and the Ukrainian team paused to confirm that the threat had been neutralized. The soldiers resumed movement once they confirmed that no secondary device had been placed on the drone. The Ukrainian units continued their advance across the forest because several shelters still needed to be inspected, and the teams moved with a steady pace that reflected their confidence after neutralizing the UAV threat. Each team checked the entrances of dugouts and abandoned structures while communicating updates to the units nearby, and they treated every location as a potential hiding place for Russian soldiers who had avoided earlier contact. One shelter showed signs of recent activity with scattered supplies on the ground, and the Ukrainian soldiers approached the entrance cautiously before entering to check the interior. No Russian soldiers remained inside, and the team marked the location as cleared before moving to the next position. Another team discovered a narrow trench segment that had partially collapsed during the earlier mortar fire, and they inspected the debris to ensure that no Russian soldiers were using the area as a concealed position. The trench was empty, and the Ukrainian commanders received confirmation that another potential resistance point had been secured. The teams continued to sweep the forest in this methodical pattern, and each successful inspection reduced the possibility of any organized defense forming behind the Ukrainian line. The clearing operation reached its final stage once all marked shelters and trenches had been checked, and the reconnaissance drone above the canopy confirmed that there were no signs of heat signatures or scattered movement across the remaining area. The Ukrainian infantry patrolled the perimeter of the forest to make sure that no hidden groups had slipped past the earlier search teams, and the calm inside the tree line showed that the resistance had collapsed fully. The commanders declared the area under Ukrainian control once all units reported that their assigned sectors were secure, and this marked the conclusion of the clearing phase. The appearance of the UAV earlier in the fight raised an important point for viewers who follow the evolution of battlefield technology. Will drones continue to shape engagements inside dense forests where visibility and movement are limited? And can infantry teams maintain control when small aerial threats enter the fight at close range? The final picture from the Serebryansky Forest is not the wrecked vehicles or the silent shelters. It is the speed, speed in detection, speed in fire, and speed in how the entire fight turned before the Russian column even reached the trees. That single chain of actions changed the shape of the day and revealed how modern battles now depend on who sees first and who reacts faster. This engagement showed how Ukrainian reconnaissance, M777 fire missions, and clearing teams connected their roles into one continuous line. The Russian push lost momentum the moment it entered that line, and every step after that shifted control further toward the Ukrainian side. Close-range clashes inside the forest, the use of mortars to break defensive pockets, and the final destruction of the FPV threat all confirmed the same trend. Small units can now control larger formations when information and timing work together. The bigger question is what comes next? Will Russia change the way it moves armored units through forest zones? Or will Ukraine face new countermeasures designed to weaken drone and reconnaissance networks? The forest battles of the next season may decide which side adapts faster, and the outcome could reshape how both armies fight across the entire front. Tell us what you think about what happened here. Do you think this new model of fast detection and precise strikes will become the rule in future operations? Share your thoughts in the comments, like the video, and subscribe to Military Force for more frontline analysis delivered with clarity and speed.